Welcome to Fireside Casebook. Come in. There's another mystery waiting by the fire.
Chapter 1. The Perils of Poaching and Pompous Men. The Scottish rain did not so much fall as it loitered. It hung in the air over the village of Lochdubh like a damp grey woolen blanket, chilling the bones and turning the surrounding mountains of Sutherland into brooding misty silhouettes. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth did not mind the rain. In fact, it provided excellent cover for his current, entirely illegal activity. Crouched beside the rushing waters of the River Corrie, Hamish held perfectly still. Beside him, his dog, Lugs, a fiercely loyal animal of indeterminate breed and frayed ears, was equally motionless. Hamish's fiery red hair was plastered to his forehead, his lanky frame folded awkwardly among the wet bracken. With a sudden, practiced flick of the wrist, the line went taut, and a few minutes of silent struggling later, a magnificent 10-pound silver salmon lay gasping on the wet grass. "Good boy, Lugs," Hamish murmured, swiftly dispatching the fish and slipping it into a burlap sack. The river technically belonged to the sprawling MacFarlane estate, but Hamish reasoned that the fish had swum from the ocean, making it public property right up until the moment it hit his frying pan. He trekked back to the Lochdubh police station, his boots squelching in the mud. The station was a modest, whitewashed building that served as his office, his home and his sanctuary from the ambitions of the modern world. He dumped the sack in the larder, stripped off his wet tunic, and put the kettle on his beloved antique cast-iron stove. He was just pouring boiling water over a deeply unpretentious spoonful of instant coffee when the telephone rang. Hamish stared at the black plastic instrument with profound distaste. If it was a local, they would have walked over or shouted through the window. Therefore, it was headquarters in Strathbane. Strathbane meant loud, aggressive superiors, usually Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose face resembled a boiled ham, and whose investigative technique involved shouting until someone confessed. If Hamish answered, there would be forms to fill out, reports to file, or worse, a reprimand for his dismal arrest quotas. Hamish let it ring. He took a sip of his coffee, scratched Lugs behind the ears, and sighed. The station was warm, the fish was secure, and a deep, comforting laziness settled over him. But peace in Lochdubh was as fleeting as a sunny day. His stomach gave a low rumble. He needed rolls to go with his poached salmon, which meant venturing into the village and facing the public. Wrapping himself in an oversized, slightly threadbare waterproof coat, Hamish meandered down the waterfront. The village consisted of a crescent of whitewashed cottages facing the sea loch, an inn, a curry house run by the ever-observant Mr. Patel, and a local general store, which doubled as the post office and the primary clearinghouse for Lochdubh gossip. The bell above the shop door jingled. Inside, the air smelled delightfully of paraffin, strong tea and digestive biscuits. "Morning, Mrs." "Wellington," Hamish said, leaning against the counter and looking as unhurried and vacuous as a grazing sheep. It was a cultivated look. Over the years, Hamish had found that if people thought you were slightly stupid, they expected very little of you. If they expected very little, they didn't promote you. And if he wasn't promoted, he wouldn't be dragged away from his beloved mountains to the concrete misery of Strathbane. "Morning, Hamish," said Mrs. "I've eyes to ki wadia redutwo you saily love. Mabers may richi baonis. It's my washay wugation hatimisters. Tu say palmfrest tirus. Her fillanove. Her fewer you sound of the timuses. Her fewer you saily taken her darsug." Wellington, the minister's wife, who was currently buying an excessive amount of bleach. Though what's good about it, I don't know. "Have you seen the Sassenach?" "The Sassenach?" Hamish asked, picking up a bag of floury baps. "Mr. Richard Sterling, Mr. Hutresa." Corrie the shopkeeper spat the name as if it were sour milk. "The new Laird of the MacFarlane estate. Bought the whole plot, the ruined keep, the river, and the moors. Arrived yesterday in a car the size of a tank." "Aye, Mrs." Wellington chimed in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He came in here demanding organic almond milk and something called artisanal sourdough. I told him we had a sliced pan of mother's pride, and he looked at me as if I'd offered him a dead rat. He's put up fences." Archie McLean, the local fisherman, rumbled from the back of the shop where he was inspecting fishing flies. "Fences, Hamish, right across the path to the East Loch. Says it's private property now, and he won't have peasants trampling his heather." Hamish blinked slowly. Peasants? Before Archie could elaborate, the shop door flew open, letting in a gust of wind, a flurry of rain, and Mr. Richard Sterling, The newcomer was a man in his late 40s who had clearly read a magazine article about how a Scottish gentleman should dress and bought the entire catalogue. He wore stiff, agonizingly new tweed, spotless leather boots, and a flat cap that had never seen a day's honest work. He had the ruddy complexion of a man who drank expensive wine and the impatient, sharp eyes of someone used to barking orders in London boardrooms. "You," Sterling barked, pointing a manicured finger at Mr. Curry. "The Wi-Fi in this forsaken village is prehistoric. I run a multinational tech firm, and I cannot even get a signal to call my architect. When is it being upgraded?" Mr. Curry stared at him. "When the sheep learn to type, I imagine." Sterling flushed angrily. He turned and noticed Hamish, taking in the red hair, the oversized coat, and the muddy boots. "Are you the local constable?" Hamish drew himself up, adopting an expression of absolute, towering stupidity. "Aye, sir. P.C. Macbeth. How can I help you?" "I want to report trespassing," Sterling snapped, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and misplaced superiority. "I found footprints on my riverbank this morning. Someone has been walking on my land. I want them found and I want them prosecuted." Hamish felt a slight twinge of guilt regarding the salmon currently sitting in his larder, but he buried it instantly. "Footprints, sir, near a river? Well, it could be a badger." "Badgers do not wear size 10 rubber boots, constable," Sterling sneered. "Listen to me. I have bought the MacFarlane estate to turn it into an exclusive high-end wellness retreat. I am bringing money into this dying little backwater, but I will not tolerate poachers, trespassers, or lazy, incompetent policing. Do you understand?" Hamish scratched his chin, looking thoroughly bewildered. "Well, sir, the wind blows terrible hard up the glen." "Might have just been the wind shaping the mud." Sterling let out a sound of pure disgust. "Good God, they told me the locals were slow, but you're practically comatose. Just stay out of my way, Macbeth. I'll be speaking to your superiors in Strathbane to get a proper security detail." With a swish of expensive tweed, the Laird marched out of the shop, the door slamming behind him. The shop descended into a heavy, loaded silence. Archie MacLean stepped out of the shadows, a dark scowl on his weathered face. "A wellness retreat," he muttered. "I'll give him wellness. Right into the lock." Now, Archie," Hamish said mildly, paying for his rolls. "Let the man be. He'll find the midges and the damp will chase him back to London before winter." But as Hamish walked back out into the rain, Lugs trotting faithfully at his heels, the sleepy comfort of the morning had vanished. He knew the Highland temper. The locals were slow to anger, but once a grudge took root, it dug in deep, like heather in the rock. Richard Sterling had been in Lochdubh for less than 48 hours, and he had already insulted the minister's wife, threatened the fishermen, and declared war on the entire village. Hamish sighed deeply, the cold rain dripping off his nose. A man like Sterling was a walking target, and if someone in Lochdubh decided to take a shot, it would mean an investigation, it would mean DCI Blair, it would mean paperwork. "Come on, Lugs," Hamish muttered, quickening his pace toward the promise of a hot stove and fresh salmon. "Let's hope the Sassenach learns to swim, because he's already drowning in enemies." Chapter 2. An Artisanal Demise. The following morning broke with deceptive brilliance. The clouds had briefly parted over Lochdubh, allowing a pale, watery sun to illuminate the purple heather and the silver expanse of the loch. Hamish Macbeth was sitting at his small kitchen table, enjoying a second cup of coffee, and contemplating the sheer, unadulterated joy of doing absolutely nothing. Lugs was asleep by the stove, twitching as he dreamed of chasing rabbits. Hamish had fully intended to spend the day avoiding the police station's paperwork, by taking a very slow, very thorough patrol of the hills, which just so happened to coincide with the best blackberry patches in the county. His reverie was shattered by the sound of heavy, panicked boots hammering against the station door. Hamish sighed, setting down his mug. "Come in, the door's open," he yelled, injecting a note of deep weariness into his voice. Willie Lamont, the local gravedigger and occasional poacher, burst into the room. Willie was pale, his eyes wide and completely devoid of their usual cheeky spark. He was gasping for air, clutching a muddy flat cap tightly in his trembling hands. "Hamish," Willie wheezed. "It's the Sassenach, the new Laird." "Mr. Sterling?" Hamish asked, not moving an inch from his comfortable chair. "Has he complained about the smell of the seaweed now, or are the midges not respecting his property lines?" "No, Hamish. He's deed. I found him up by the old ruined keep on the MacFarlane estate." Willie swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Well, it's a terrible, undignified way to go." Hamish closed his eyes for a brief mourning second. He mourned his unpicked blackberries. He mourned his quiet morning. And most intensely, he mourned the inevitable arrival of his superiors. "Show me," Hamish said, grabbing his oversized waterproof coat and whistling for Lugs. The walk up to the MacFarlane estate was steep, winding through dense gorse and rocky outcrops. The air grew thinner and colder, the brief morning sunshine already swallowed by rolling grey clouds. When they reached the ruins of the old stone keep, the designated site of Stirling's planned high-end wellness centre, Hamish stopped and stared. He had seen many dead bodies in his time, but few had looked quite so ridiculous. Richard Stirling was protruding from a massive ornate wooden barrel. The barrel, which still bore an expensive Italian shipping label, was meant to be a rustic rainwater feature for his retreat. Stirling was head first inside it. Only his legs were visible, clad in excruciatingly new bright yellow Hunter Wellington boots pointing stiffly toward the Highland sky. His expensive tweed trousers were bunched up awkwardly around his knees. "I was just coming up to check the traps," Willie mumbled, quickly correcting himself. "I mean check the fences," when I saw the yellow boots sticking up. Hamish approached the barrel, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He ambled over, Lugs sniffing curiously at the base of the barrel, before letting out a low, uneasy whine. "Help me pull him out, Willie," Hamish instructed. With a wet, sucking sound, they hauled the late Richard Stirling onto the damp grass. The man's face was purple, his eyes bulging, and his lungs clearly full of stagnant, algae-ridden rainwater. He looked far less imposing than he had the day before in Mrs. Wellington's shop. Hamish knelt beside the body, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, looking for all the world like a man trying to remember where he left his car keys. But his light hazel eyes missed absolutely nothing. He noted the deep, muddy scuff marks on the toes of the bright yellow wellies, marks that went upward, as if Stirling had been furiously kicking against the side of the barrel while being held down. He also noticed a strong, pungent scent cutting through the smell of damp wool and stagnant water. It was the sharp, unmistakable tang of a very specific, cheap aftershave, the kind sold by the gallon in Strathbane discount supermarkets, a far cry from Stirling's bespoke London cologne. Finally, Hamish's gaze fell upon Stirling's left wrist. The skin was pale where a watch had been, but the heavy gold Rolex he had worn yesterday was missing. "A robbery gone wrong?" Willie asked nervously, following Hamish's gaze. "Perhaps," Hamish said mildly, though his mind was racing. "Or someone wants it to look that way. A man doesn't dive headfirst into a rain barrel for a morning swim, Willie." Hamish stood up, brushing a spot of mud from his knee. He looked out over the bleak, beautiful expanse of Lochdubh. The peaceful village looked like a postcard, but Hamish knew the dark currents that ran beneath the polite nods and the Sunday church services. Someone had hated the arrogant newcomer enough to drown him in his own imported garden feature. "Right, Willie," Hamish sighed, the weight of the world, and the impending paperwork, settling heavily on his lanky shoulders. "You go back to the village. Tell Mr. Curry to lock his doors, just in case. And he grimaced as if swallowing sour milk. "I had better go and phone Strathbane. DCI Blair is going to be in a foul mood having to drive up here in the damp." Chapter 3. The Strathbane Circus arrives. It took exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes for the peace of Lochdubh to be thoroughly obliterated. The arrival of the Strathbane murder squad was never a subtle affair. 2 rovers came screaming up the single-track road, their sirens wailing unnecessarily, startling a flock of grazing sheep and sending them bleating into the heather. The cars squealed to a halt at the base of the MacFarlane estate trail. Hamish Macbeth was waiting for them up at the ruined keep. He had spent the intervening time sitting on a damp boulder, smoking a thin roll-up cigarette and allowing Lugs to patrol the perimeter. He watched with mild, detached amusement as Detective Chief Inspector Blair led his team up the steep incline. Blair was a man who looked perpetually on the verge of a massive coronary event. He was heavily built, with a face the colour of raw beef and a temperament to match. He wore a loud checked suit that struggled to contain his girth and an expression of profound disgust, as if the very air of the Highlands was personally offensive to him. Trailing miserably behind him was Detective Jimmy Anderson, a gloomy man who permanently smelled of stale peppermints and impending defeat. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind like a foghorn. He stopped halfway up the hill, clutching his knees and wheezing. "Why, in the name of all that is holy, do people in this god-forsaken wilderness insist on dying at the top of a mountain?" "It's a hill, sir." "Hubscheisild," Hamish corrected mildly, rising from his boulder and adopting his most vacuous, slack-jawed expression. "And he didn't die at the top exactly, he drowned in a barrel." Blair finally reached the summit, his chest heaving. He glowered at Hamish, taking in the local constable's muddy boots, oversized coat, and generally unhurried demeanour. "You look like a scarecrow that's given up on life, Macbeth. Have you trampled all over my crime scene with your enormous peasant feet?" "No, sir," Hamish said, blinking innocently. I just pulled him out so he wouldn't get waterlogged, and then I waited for the real detectives to arrive. Blair grunted, somewhat mollified by the flattery, though he still looked at Hamish as if he was something unpleasant scraped off the bottom of a shoe. He stomped over to the body of Richard Sterling. Jimmy Anderson gave Hamish a brief, sympathetic nod before pulling out a notebook. Jimmy knew Hamish wasn't as stupid as he looked, but he also knew better than to ever point this out to Blair. Right, Blair barked, standing over the sodden, tweed-clad corpse. He noted the bruised wrists and the muddy yellow Wellingtons. Then his piggy eyes locked onto the pale band of skin on Sterling's left wrist. Aha, look at that, Anderson. The man's been stripped of his valuables. Classic robbery with violence. His wallet is still in his inside pocket, sir. Hamish offered gently. I checked. It's got a thick wad of £50 notes in it. Blair's face darkened to a dangerous shade of plum. I didn't ask you for an inventory, Macbeth. Criminals panic. They grab the shiny watch and they run. It's a mugging gone wrong. The victim puts up a fight. The thief shoves him into the nearest water feature and legs it. It's textbook. If you say so, sir, Hamish murmured, retreating a step. He knew that suggesting the killer might have staged the robbery to cover their tracks, or pointing out the distinct lack of footprints fleeing the scene, would only result in Blair shouting until his blood pressure skyrocketed. Hamish also kept the lingering scent of cheap aftershave entirely to himself. If Blair couldn't smell it over his own stale cigar smoke, that was his problem. Who found him? Blair snapped, turning away from the body. Willie Lamont, sir. He was checking the fences. Blair's eyes lit up with predatory glee. Lamont? That shiftless little poacher? He's got a record for petty theft as long as my arm. The man's a menace. He sees a wealthy Sassenach wandering around with a Rolex, decides to relieve him of it, and things get out of hand. Willie wouldn't hurt a fly, sir, Hamish protested, dropping the idiot act for a fraction of a second. He's a coward. He'd run a mile before he'd try to drown a man twice his size. That is exactly the kind of bleeding heart small-town nonsense that keeps you stuck in this miserable village, Macbeth, Blair roared, jabbing a thick finger into Hamish's chest. Lamont is our man. Anderson, go down to the village and drag that little rat into the station. I want him sweating in an interview room within the hour. Jimmy Anderson sighed heavily. Yes, sir. As for you, Macbeth, Blair sneered, looking Hamish up and down. You can make yourself useful. Go stand at the bottom of the road and make sure none of the local yokels come up here gawking. Leave the actual police work to the professionals. Yes, DCI Blair, Hamish said, executing a sloppy, exaggerated salute. As Blair turned his back to bark orders at the forensics team that was finally trudging up the hill, a small secret smile played at the corners of Hamish's mouth. Sidelined, it was exactly what he wanted. While Blair wasted his time bullying poor Willie Lamont into a false confession, Hamish was free to wander back down to Lochdubh. The real answers wouldn't be found under a microscope or beaten out of a frightened poacher. They would be found over a pot of tea, a slice of Victoria sponge, and the quiet, deadly gossip of the village. Hamish whistled for Lugs, his mind already turning to who he should visit first. Chapter 4, Tea, Sympathy and Slander. The walk back down the glen felt significantly lighter now that the professional circus had set up camp at the ruins. Hamish ambled along, Lugs trotting by his side, pausing only to examine a patch of damp moss that looked like it had been recently disturbed. He didn't pick it up, he just noted its position relative to the main path. As he reached the village proper, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. The news of Sterling's death had travelled faster than a forest fire. Blinds were twitching in every cottage window, and the few villagers brave enough to be out on the street were huddled in groups, their faces tight with a mixture of fear and poorly concealed satisfaction. Hamish ignored the questioning stares and headed straight for the warmth of the village tea-room. It was a modest establishment run by Mrs. Macfie, a woman whose scones were as heavy as her opinions and whose capacity for eavesdropping was legendary. He pushed the door open, the little bell chiming a cheerful note that sat at odds with the gloom outside. Mrs. Macfie was behind the counter, polishing a silver teapot with frantic energy. Hamish, she breathed, her eyes widening behind her spectacles. Tell me it's true? The Sassenach is really gone. I'm afraid so, Mrs. Macfie, Hamish said, sliding into his favourite booth in the corner. A terrible tragedy. Tragedy? Mrs. Macfie snorted, setting down the teapot with a clatter. The man was a menace. Do you know what he did yesterday? He had the audacity to tell the parish council that our church choir was an affront to auditory decency and offered to hire a professional ensemble from Edinburgh to replace us. Hamish ordered a pot of tea and a slice of fruitcake, watching as the room slowly filled with a few more locals. He wasn't here to interrogate. He was here to listen. He let his posture slump, his eyes glazing over as he gazed out the window, his appearance suggesting a man whose brain was currently buffering. Poor Willie Lamont, remarked Sarah, the local librarian, as she joined the table. They took him away in handcuffs, did you see? DCI Blair was shouting at him something fierce. Blair's a fool, Hamish murmured, seemingly distracted by a speck of dust on his sleeve. Willie's not a murderer. He's a thief. Aye, a terrible one, mind, but not a killer. Then who would want Sterling dead? Sarah whispered, leaning in. He hadn't been here long enough to make real enemies. Except, well, everyone. Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his tea. He was talking about a wellness retreat, wasn't he? Spending a lot of money. Spending? My mooses, McPhee laughed, a brittle, sharp sound. He was buying. He'd been pressuring old Mr. Henderson to sell his cottage for weeks, offered him a pittance, and threatened to have the council condemn the property if he didn't comply. Mr. Henderson was devastated. He's lived there for 60 years. Hamish frowned slightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his mug. Mr. Henderson? The man who keeps the bees? The very one, Sarah confirmed. The last time I saw him, he was at the post office, absolutely livid. He said he'd sooner see the whole estate burn to the ground than let Sterling turn it into a playground for rich tourists. Hamish didn't respond immediately. He was busy cataloguing the information. Sterling had been a bully, that much was clear. He had stepped on toes, threatened livelihoods, and treated the locals like furniture. But bullying rarely led to murder in Lochdubh. Something had pushed someone over the edge. As the afternoon wore on, Hamish continued his mooching. He visited Mr. Patel at the curry house, who provided a spicy onion bhaji, and the observation that Sterling had been seen arguing with a woman near the old bridge late the previous night. A woman? Hamish asked, picking at a crumb. Very tall, dark hair, dressed in those expensive sensible walking clothes, Mr. Voice. Patel replied, cleaning a tray. They were shouting, Hamish. She looked agitated. I thought they were just another couple of tourists having a spat until I saw him drive off toward the estate. I didn't see her face, but she walked away toward the woods. Hamish's heart gave a subtle, uncomfortable thump. Tall, dark hair, sensible walking clothes. That sounded uncomfortably like Priscilla Halberton Smythe. He left the curry house and found himself walking toward the edge of the village, his mind swirling. He couldn't shake the image of Sterling's yellow boots. The killer hadn't just pushed him, they had held him down. That required a certain amount of physical strength. But more importantly, it required a cold, calculated rage. He pulled out his pipe, though he didn't light it. He needed to think, and the smell of the tobacco always helped. He had a murderer to catch, an innocent man to save from a wrongful arrest, and a potential love interest who might have been at the scene of the crime. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the village, Hamish realized he was being watched. He didn't turn around, but he felt the gaze, cold and intent, following him from the cover of the trees. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was becoming the prey. Right then, he whispered to the wind. Let's see who's playing games. He turned down the narrow path that led to the old bridge, his pace steady, his hand resting casually in his pocket, waiting to see who would show their hand first. Chapter 5. A lady, a liar, and a very stiff drink. The wind had picked up, whistling a mournful tune through the gap in the valley as Hamish reached the bridge. He stopped, leaning his elbows against the weathered stone parapet, staring down into the dark, swirling water below. He didn't look back, but he knew the footsteps had ceased somewhere behind him, hidden by the rustle of the gorse. It's a long walk for a stroll, Priscilla, Hamish said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the crisp air. There was a brief silence, followed by the soft crunch of gravel as a tall, elegant woman stepped from the shadows. Priscilla Halberton Smythe moved with the effortless grace of someone who had never had to worry about where her next meal was coming from. She was dressed in an expensive, high-quality wax jacket, her dark hair tucked neatly into a practical headband. You have ears like a fox, Hamish, she said, coming to stand beside him. She looked down at the water, her expression uncharacteristically strained. And you, Hamish replied, turning to look at her, have been heard arguing with the late Mr. Sterling. That's a dangerous pastime in a village where everyone hears everything through the walls. Priscilla sighed, a sharp, ragged sound. She didn't deny it. I was arguing with him. He was a bore, a bully, and he had no right to be here. He was planning to tear down the original MacFarlane stables, the ones with the 18th century stonework, just to build a climate-controlled yoga studio. I said everything. And did he? He laughed at me, Hamish. He told me that my sentimental drivel was outdated and that he had already secured the demolition permits from someone in the planning office. Her eyes narrowed. He was a thief of history. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're about to ask. I left him standing by the bridge at 10 o'clock. He was very much alive, and very much shouting about his own brilliance. Hamish studied her. He knew Priscilla. She was fierce, opinionated, and stubborn, but she was not a murderer. She lacked the necessary malice to drown a man in a barrel. "I believe you," he said softly. Priscilla looked surprised, then softened. "You're a rare man, Hamish. Most people would have tried to arrest me just for the sport of it." "I'm too tired for paperwork," he replied, and for once he wasn't joking. He shifted his gaze back to the bridge. "There's something else, Priscilla. Someone took his watch, and I think they wanted it to look like a robbery, but they did a poor job of it." "A watch?" She frowned. "His Rolex. He was obsessed with that thing. He used to check the time every 5 minutes, as if he couldn't bear to waste a second of his precious existence." "Exactly," Hamish said, his eyes narrowing. "He checked it constantly. If he'd been mugged, the robber would have had to rip it off his wrist. It would have left marks. But there were no marks on his skin, just the pale band where it had been. It was removed calmly, after he was dead." Priscilla shivered, drawing her jacket tighter. "That's chilling. It means the killer had time to stand over him, take the watch, and walk away." "It means the killer knew him," Hamish corrected. "And it means they took it not for the money, but for the symbol. To stop him from knowing what time it was, perhaps. Or maybe just to spite him." Priscilla looked at him, her gaze intense. "Hamish, you're doing it again, playing the fool while your mind is putting the pieces together. Why do you pretend to be so dense?" Hamish shrugged, a lopsided, self-deprecating grin spreading across his face. "If I was smart, Priscilla, they'd send me to Glasgow or Inverness. I'd be wearing a suit every day, sitting in a windowless office, and I'd never get to eat a salmon caught by moonlight. Here, I'm just Hamish. I like being just Hamish." "You're a complex man," she murmured. "But be careful. Blair is already convinced it was Willie. He's going to bully a confession out of him if he doesn't find a reason to stop. You need to prove someone else was there." "I know," Hamish said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper he'd found, tucked into a crack in the stone wall near the ruins earlier that day. He unfolded it. It was a receipt from a local garage for a specialized type of grease, one used for heavy machinery, the kind of machinery Sterling had been planning to bring in for his construction. "This was near the barrel," Hamish said. "Whoever killed him didn't just walk up the hill. They had been working on something heavy, something mechanical." Priscilla stared at the paper. "That's from McLean's garage. Archie's son Dougie runs that place." "Aye," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, thoughtful murmur. "Dougie. He's always been a quiet lad, and he hated Sterling's plan for the estate more than anyone. Said the vibration from the heavy equipment would ruin his workshop foundations." "Do you think he did it?" "I think," Hamish said, pushing off the wall, "that I need a very stiff drink and a long talk with a young man who likes machines. And Priscilla, keep your head down. If someone realizes you saw them near the bridge, you might be the next one in a barrel." He turned and began the long walk back toward the village, his shadow stretching long and thin in the dying light. The mystery was hardening, shifting from the abstract anger of the village into something cold and concrete. He had a suspect, a motive, and a piece of evidence. Now, he just had to survive DCI Blair's incompetence long enough to prove it. Chapter 6. The Grease Monkey's Secret. The lights at McLean's garage were flickering, casting long, jittery shadows against the corrugated iron walls. It was well past 7, but the scent of hot oil and burnt rubber hung heavy in the damp Highland air. Hamish pushed the sliding door open, the metal groaning in protest. Inside, Dougie McLean was hunched over the engine block of a tractor, his face smeared with grease, his hands moving with the rhythmic precision of a man trying to forget the world. When he saw Hamish, he jumped, a wrench slipping from his fingers and clattering onto the concrete floor with a sound like a gunshot. "Lord, Hamish, you scared the life out of me," Dougie muttered, wiping his hands on a filthy rag. He was a sturdy lad, quiet by nature, but tonight his eyes were darting toward the back office with a frantic energy that set Hamish's teeth on edge. "Quiet night for engine work, isn't it, Dougie?" Hamish said, wandering deeper into the garage. He leaned against a workbench, picking up a stray bolt and turning it over in his fingers. He looked, as always, like he had nothing more on his mind than the weather, but he was cataloguing every detail of the room, the pristine state of the specialized tools, the way Dougie kept his back to the office door, and the faint lingering smell of cheap chemical aftershave that clung to the air. It was the same scent Hamish had caught on the wind at the crime scene. "Tractor's acting up," Dougie said, his voice tight. "Needs a new gasket. Sterling's wellness retreat trucks have been tearing up the lower road, and it's wreaking havoc on the suspension of everything in the valley." "Aye, they were heavy beasts," Hamish agreed. He moved a few steps closer to the office, his eyes fixed on the pegboard of tools. "Tragic about Mr. Sterling, wasn't it? Found him in that barrel, a nasty way to go." Dougie's back stiffened. "I wouldn't know. I was here all morning. Were you?" Hamish asked, his tone airy and conversational. Funny thing that. I found a receipt for high viscosity bearing grease up by the ruins, the kind you use for the heavy excavators Sterling was bringing in. Looks like it fell out of someone's pocket. Dougie went very still. The only sound in the garage was the steady drip of condensation hitting a puddle on the floor, probably fell out of a delivery driver's pocket. They were up there constantly. Maybe, Hamish said, stepping closer to the office door, though the ink is quite fresh, and it's marked with a paid stamp from your shop, dated yesterday. Dougie spun around, his face a mask of panicked defiance. So, I sold it to someone. That doesn't make me a murderer, Hamish. You can't just come in here and— I didn't say it made you a murderer, Dougie, Hamish interrupted, his voice dropping to a gentle warning tone. I said it was a strange thing to find at a crime scene, almost as strange as that bottle of Ocean Breeze aftershave sitting on your desk. Dougie looked at the desk, then back at Hamish, his shoulders slumping as if the air had been let out of him. I didn't mean to kill him, Hamish, I swear to you. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Hamish felt no triumph, only a deep, wary sadness. Tell me what happened, Dougie. He came here, Dougie whispered, his voice trembling. 2 days ago. He told me he was buying the garage land to turn it into a parking lot for his guests. Said he'd give me 24 hours to vacate. When I told him it had been in my family for 3 generations, he laughed. He called me a grease-stained peasant, and said if I didn't leave, he'd find a way to have the business shut down for environmental violations. So you went to talk to him. I went to beg him to reconsider, Dougie said, his eyes welling up. I found him at the keep. He was gloating, Hamish. He had a glass of wine in his hand and he was mocking me, telling me he'd already signed the contracts. I lost it. I grabbed him by the lapels to shake some sense into him and he slipped. He fell headfirst into that damn barrel. He was so drunk, or maybe just so surprised, that he didn't even fight back. He couldn't get his footing. And you just left him? Hamish asked, his voice low. I tried to pull him out, but he was heavy, and I panicked. I thought, if I'm seen here, they'll blame me. I saw his watch. It had fallen off during the struggle, and I just grabbed it. I thought if I made it look like a robbery, they'd think some drifter did it. Dougie buried his face in his grease-stained hands. I'm no killer, Hamish. I'm just a mechanic. Hamish stood in the silence of the garage, watching the young man break. He knew the law. He knew the procedure. If he called Blair now, Dougie would be dragged off to prison, his life destroyed for a moment of madness, triggered by a man who had been a parasite on the community. Dougie, Hamish said, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Give me the watch. Dougie reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy gold Rolex. It felt cold and heavy in Hamish's palm. Listen to me, Hamish said, his voice steely and authoritative. DCI Blair is a man who likes things simple. He has a suspect in custody, Willie Lamont. If you go to him now, he'll be thrilled to have a confession, but he won't care about the context. He'll bury you. What do I do? You go home, Hamish said. You say nothing to anyone, not a word. I'm going to handle Blair, but you have to promise me, Dougie. You stay out of sight, and you pray that Blair is as lazy and arrogant as I think he is. As he stepped out of the garage and into the cooling night air, Hamish tucked the watch into his own pocket. He had his murderer, and he had his truth. Now, he had to perform the most difficult task of his career. He had to make sure the right man didn't go to jail without being so clever that he got himself promoted. Chapter 7. The Art of the Incompetent Lead. The following morning, the Scottish weather had returned to its default setting, a relentless, soaking drizzle that turned the path to the ruins into a slick slide of mud. Hamish Macbeth trudged up the hill, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He was feeling particularly uninspired, a state he cultivated with the dedication of a fine artist. He found DCI Blair pacing outside the police cordon, waving a soggy sandwich in one hand and shouting at a very bored-looking constable. I don't care about the wind speed, man, Blair was bellowing. I want that poacher Lamont processed. We have his motive, the watch, and his proximity. We don't need a forensics report to tell us the village idiot is our man. Hamish approached, stepping carefully to avoid the mud. He looked, by design, as if he had just crawled out of a long, unplanned nap. He blinked slowly at Blair, who turned on him with a snarl. Macbeth, I thought I told you to keep the locals away. What are you doing here? Well, sir, Hamish began, his voice drawling and hesitant. I was just doing my rounds, like you said, and I found something. It's probably nothing, being as I'm not a real detective and all. But I thought I should mention it before you finished up with Willie. Blair stopped mid-bite, his face reddening. If this is another one of your it could be a badger theories, I'll have you peeling potatoes in a basement in Glasgow for the next decade. No, sir, Hamish said, looking at his boots. It's about the watch, the one you're so sure Willie stole. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the heavy gold Rolex. He held it out on his flat palm, as if he were holding a slightly soiled handkerchief. Blair snatched it from him, his eyes widening. "Where did you get this?" "I found it down by the stream, sir, just a few hundred yards from the garage. It was caught on a bramble, almost like it had been dropped in a hurry. I suppose Willie must have panicked when he heard your squad cars, and ditched it in the water." Hamish paused, making sure his expression remained perfectly blank. "It's a funny thing, though. The clasp is broken. It looks like it didn't get ripped off a wrist, but more like it just snapped. Maybe when someone hit it against a stone while they were running through the dark." Blair grunted, turning the watch over in his thick fingers. He clearly didn't have the patience for the technicalities of forensic evidence. To him, the item was just another piece of junk to be bagged and tagged. "Dropped in the water, eh? Well, that confirms it. The man's a clumsy amateur. He's panicked and tossed the evidence." "Aye, that's what I thought," Hamish agreed, nodding vigorously. "But there's one more thing, sir, and this is the part that's got me a bit confused, being as I'm just a simple constable." Blair sighed, a sound like steam escaping a radiator. "Speak, man. What is it?" "Well, I was looking at the mud down by the garage, you know, where I found the watch, and I saw some tracks. Very deep ones, like a heavy boot, or maybe a boot with a specialized industrial tread." Hamish let his voice trail off, looking up at the sky as if searching for inspiration. "But I suppose that's nothing, really. I shouldn't have bothered you with it. You've got the case all wrapped up with Willie, and he's confessed, hasn't he?" Blair looked at him, his brow furrowed. "He hasn't confessed yet, but he's currently in the station, and I'm about to go in and break him." "Why?" "Oh, no reason," Hamish said quickly. "It's just, if you arrest Willie and the evidence points to a specialized boot print that doesn't match his, the paperwork would be awful, wouldn't it? DCI, you'd have to file a whole extra section on mismatched trace evidence, and that would probably delay the case closing. It would be a terrible shame for your reputation, sir. Everyone in Strathbane is waiting for you to solve this quickly." Blair's eyes narrowed. He looked at the watch, then at the mud-slicked hill, and finally at Hamish. The thought of extra paperwork and the prospect of a delayed commendation seemed to be battling for dominance in his small, red-faced head. "You're saying," Blair growled, "that if I arrest Lamont, I might look foolish if the evidence doesn't align." "I'm just saying that you're a busy man, sir," Hamish said, leaning on his dumb persona with all his might. "And Willie is such an easy target that maybe, just maybe, he's a bit too convenient. A man of your standing, sir, you want a conviction that sticks, don't you? One that the papers will praise as a masterpiece of investigation." Blair puffed out his chest. "You're right, Macbeth. You're entirely right. I don't need a petty thief. I need the real culprit." He turned toward his team. "Anderson, forget the poacher for a moment. We need to canvass the area for anyone with heavy-duty footwear. We're looking for a professional, someone who knows their way around the machinery at the site." Hamish offered a small internal sigh of relief. By giving Blair a new, more prestigious target to hunt, the mysterious professional, who would surely lead Blair into a dead-end maze of his own making, he had bought Dougie the time he needed to disappear, or at least to bury his involvement. "I'll leave you to it then, sir," Hamish said, backing away. "I've got a mountain of files waiting back at the station. Wouldn't want to get in the way of a real investigation." Blair didn't even acknowledge him. He was already barking orders into his radio, his face set in a mask of self-important concentration. Hamish turned and began his slow, deliberate walk back to Lochdubh. He had saved a boy, kept his own quiet life intact, and left his superior chasing shadows. It was, he decided, a fairly productive morning. Chapter 8. The Ghost of the Highlands. The days following the discovery of Richard Sterling's body were characterized by a manic, low-level chaos that only DCI Blair could incite. The police presence in Lochdubh had doubled, and the village felt like an occupied territory. Blair, having abandoned the easy target of Willie Lamont, had pivoted to a new, equally misguided theory, that Sterling had been murdered by an international corporate saboteur. He was currently interviewing every delivery driver, surveyor, and itinerant worker within a 50-mile radius, convinced he was closing in on a criminal mastermind. Hamish, meanwhile, had retreated into the domestic bliss of his station. He had spent the morning baking a batch of scones, and was currently sitting by his stove, listening to the radio, and enjoying the absolute silence of a life unburdened by ambition. The peace was interrupted, however, by a soft, hesitant knock at his door. Hamish opened it to find Dougie MacLean. The young man looked pale and drawn, his eyes rimmed with red. He was wearing a heavy parka and carrying a small duffel bag. "Hamish," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I'm going. I'm heading for the coast. I can't stay here while they're tearing the place apart." Hamish sighed, stepping aside to let him in. "Sit down, lad. Have a scone." "I can't eat," Dougie said, dropping his bag. "Blair's men were at the garage this morning. They were measuring the tread on every pair of work boots I own. They didn't find anything. But I know it's only a matter of time before they start digging into the receipts. I can't live like this." Hamish poured him a cup of tea. He watched the boy, seeing the remnants of his own youth in that panicked, trapped expression. "Blair is looking for a shadow, Dougie. He's looking for a high-tech thief in a tailored suit. He's not looking for a local mechanic who had a bad day. As long as you stay quiet, and as long as you don't do anything else to draw attention to yourself, he'll get bored. He'll find a convenient scapegoat, blame it on a wandering drifter, and move on. It's what he does. But what if they find the truth?" "The truth is a messy thing," Hamish said, his voice hardening. "It rarely makes for a clean police report. If you stay and face it, you'll be destroyed. If you go, you're just another missing person in a country full of them." Dougie looked at him, his gaze searching. "You really think I can get away with it?" "I think," Hamish said, "that the world is a very large place and Lochdubh is a very small one. If you want a second chance, take it, but don't look back." As Dougie left, the weight of the moment settled over Hamish. He knew he was technically obstructing justice. He knew he was failing in his duties as a police officer, but he looked at the photograph of the village on his wall, a picture of calm, of simple lives, of the kind of place where a man like Richard Sterling could never truly belong. He wasn't protecting a murderer, he was protecting a piece of the world that he loved. That evening the village tea room was abuzz with rumour. Blair had apparently declared the investigation at a critical juncture, which was code for he had absolutely no idea what was going on. Hamish sat in the corner nursing a lukewarm coffee when Priscilla Halberton Smythe slipped into the booth across from him. She looked elegant as always, but her eyes were sharp and knowing. "He's left, hasn't he?" she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Hamish didn't blink. "Who?" "Dougie. He's gone, Hamish. The garage is locked up, and there's a for sale sign hanging on the door. You helped him." Hamish didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression as unreadable as the surface of the lock. "Don't look so worried," she murmured, leaning across the table. "I'm not going to report you. I think, in a strange, twisted way, you've done exactly what needed to be done. Sterling was a blight, and sometimes the landscape needs a bit of weeding. But you're playing a dangerous game, Hamish. Blair isn't as stupid as you want everyone to think. He's just arrogant, and eventually, even an arrogant man notices when the pieces don't fit. Then the pieces don't have to fit for him to be satisfied," Hamish said. "He just needs a picture that looks like justice. And if he doesn't get it, then I suppose I'll have to find one for him," Hamish said. He stood up, placing his empty cup on the tray. "I think I'm going to go for a walk, Priscilla. There's something I need to check at the ruins one last time. Something that might just give DCI Blair the masterpiece he's looking for." He walked out into the cool, damp night, the wind pulling at his hair. He had one last trick up his sleeve, a way to finish this, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that his own quiet, lazy life remained undisturbed. It was the hardest thing he'd ever have to do, but he was a Macbeth of Lochdubh, and he wasn't going to let anyone else ruin his home. Chapter 9. The final act of the lazy policeman. The ruins of the MacFarlane estate stood under a sliver of moon, looking like the skeletal remains of a forgotten giant. Hamish climbed the path with a practiced ease, his lungs barely straining. He had a small bundle tucked under his arm, a set of old, weathered tools he'd taken from a disused shed behind his own station, and a worn-out, mud-caked pair of boots he'd scavenged from the local dump. He wasn't going to solve the crime. He was going to curate the aftermath. The forensic team had left the site hours ago, leaving behind a pathetic yellow tape that fluttered in the gale like a dying flag. Hamish walked to the soft, marshy ground near the rain barrel. He knelt, his movements precise and deliberate. He used the tools to dig a small, shallow hole in the mud, then pressed the heels of the scavenged boots into the earth, creating a set of tracks that appeared to lead away from the barrel toward the steep, dangerous cliffs of the northern crags. He didn't make them look perfect. Real life was never perfect. He added a scuff mark here, a slight drag there, as if someone had been carrying something heavy and awkward, perhaps a toolkit or a sack of evidence. Finally, he took the most important piece of the puzzle, a spare rusted key he had lifted from the back of Sterling's own rental car during his initial incompetent inspection. He pressed the key deep into the mud near the cliff edge, then partially covered it with moss. It was a clumsy, desperate trail. It suggested that a disgruntled local, panicked by the accidental death of the Laird, had tried to hide the evidence and then, in a fit of terror, had likely slipped and fallen into the treacherous ravines below. It was a narrative that fit Blair's penchant for dramatic, tragic endings. It was also a narrative that ensured no one would go looking for a living suspect. "There," Hamish whispered to the empty air. A nice, tidy end to a messy business. He stood up, his knees popping, and began his descent back toward the village. But as he reached the halfway point, he saw the beam of a flashlight cutting through the fog. He didn't run, that would be suspicious. He simply pulled his pipe from his pocket, struck a match, and waited. The figure emerged from the gloom. It was DCI Blair, looking more disheveled than ever, his suit jacket soaked through and his face a mottled, angry red. "Macbeth?" Blair shouted, his voice cracking. "What the hell are you doing up here at this hour?" "Just checking the perimeter, sir," Hamish said, his voice as smooth as cream. "Like you asked, I thought I saw some movement up by the crags, looked like a man in a hurry." Blair stopped, his eyes lighting up with that familiar predatory hunger. "Movement? A man? Where, you idiot?" Hamish gestured vaguely toward the northern cliffs. "Over that way, sir." He looked to be heading for the drop. "I tried to follow, but it was dark, and I'm not as young as I used to be." Blair didn't waste a second. He turned and started scrambling up the hill, his breathing ragged and loud. "Anderson, get the teams up here. We've got him. We've finally got our man." Hamish watched them go. He could hear the shouts, the sound of boots on wet rock, and the general cacophony of a police squad running in the wrong direction. He knew what they would find. They would find the boot prints, they would find the key, and they would construct a story about a desperate, guilt-ridden saboteur who had met a watery end in the dark. It would be a closed case by morning. Hamish turned away, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. He had managed it. Doogie was safe, Willie was cleared, and the mystery of the Laird of Lochdubh would be recorded as a tragic misadventure by a nameless, invisible killer who had conveniently vanished into the sea. He reached the bottom of the hill and paused. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting a silver light over the village. Everything looked exactly the same. The cottages, the dark water of the loch, the quiet, sleeping streets. It was the same village he had protected for years, the same place where he sat and drank his tea and listened to the secrets of the stones. He felt no guilt. In the Highlands, justice wasn't about the law, it was about balance. Sterling had disrupted the balance, and the land in its own way had corrected the error. He arrived back at his station, his boots caked in mud. He kicked them off, hung up his coat, and walked to his stove. He put the kettle on and sat down in his chair, Lugs resting his head on his feet. The telephone on the desk rang. A sharp, shrill sound in the quiet room. Hamish ignored it. It would be Blair, calling from the cliffside, shouting about keys and footprints and his own brilliance. Hamish didn't want to hear it. He wanted his tea. He wanted his sleep. He wanted his Lochdubh, exactly as it had been before the Sassenach came to stir the dust. He closed his eyes, the warmth of the stove seeping into his bones, and let the silence of the Highlands wash over him. The case was closed, and for the first time in a week, Hamish Macbeth was once again, and quite happily, the most useless policeman in Scotland. Chapter 10. The Quiet Return. The morning after the discovery on the crags, Lochdubh was bathed in a clarity that only a post-storm Highland day could provide. The air was sharp, smelling of wet earth and wild thyme, and the loch was as still as a sheet of hammered silver. Hamish stood outside his station, leaning against the whitewashed wall with a steaming mug of tea in his hand. From the direction of the village square he could hear the faint, triumphant blare of sirens, the Strathbane police, packing up their equipment and heading back to the mainland. DCI Blair, looking exhausted but inexplicably proud, stomped over to where Hamish was standing. His uniform was stained with mud, and he smelled of bog water and stale adrenaline. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, though he lacked his usual venom, "it's over. The forensics team recovered the key, and the tracks confirm our theory. The suspect, a transient worker, likely someone involved in the illegal equipment trade, panicked, fled toward the crags, and clearly fell. With the tide as it is, we'll never find the body. But the case is closed." Drowned in his own stupidity, Hamish took a slow, thoughtful sip of his tea. He looked at Blair with wide, vacant eyes, the picture of mild-mannered incompetence. "Is that so, sir? A terrible way to go. It's a good thing you were here to figure it out. I wouldn't have known where to look." Blair puffed out his chest, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he was essentially taking credit for a trail of breadcrumbs Hamish had laid out for him. "It takes a professional eye, Macbeth. You'd do well to learn from this. I'll be putting in a report to the Commissioner highlighting how my quick intervention prevented a long drawn-out investigation that would have paralyzed this village." "I'm sure they'll be very impressed, sir," Hamish said, bowing his head slightly to hide the twitch of a smile. "Will you be needing anything else before you head back to Strathbane?" "No," Blair grunted, glancing at his watch. "I've had enough of this damp, backward hole to last me a lifetime. Try not to let anyone die until next year, would you?" As the police convoy pulled away, kicking up gravel and disappearing down the narrow, winding road, Hamish felt the tension that had gripped the village begin to dissipate. He watched them go until the last siren faded into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the cry of a lone gull and the soft lap of water against the pier. He wandered down to the tea room. Mrs. McPhee was already rearranging her display of shortbread, her face radiating a smug sort of relief. When she saw Hamish, she didn't say a word, just poured him a fresh cup of tea and slid a warm buttery scone across the counter. "They're gone then?" she asked softly. "They are," Hamish replied, taking a bite of the scone. It was perfect. "The Laird is accounted for, the village is quiet, and the world is back to its natural order." "And the boy," she whispered, leaning in. "Dougie." "The boy is far away," Hamish said, his tone final. "Somewhere where he doesn't have to worry about yoga studios or parking lots. He's gone to start over, and we're going to let him." Mrs. McPhee nodded, her lips tight. "It's for the best. Some things are better left buried in the moss." Hamish spent the rest of the day wandering the hills. He climbed until his legs ached, reaching the high ridge where the heather gave way to rock, and the view of the Western Isles stretched out before him, in a haze of blue. He thought about the watch he had hidden deep in his own dresser drawer, a piece of gold that now meant nothing. He would take it to the next big city he visited, and drop it into a fountain or an alleyway. It was a weight he didn't want, a symbol of a man who had tried to buy a piece of the world and ended up being swallowed by it. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and burning gold, Hamish sat down on a patch of soft grass. Lugs sat beside him, his head resting on his master's knee. They watched the light fade from the mountains, the shadows growing long and deep across the valley. He was tired, a deep soul-reaching fatigue that came from carrying the secrets of an entire village. But as he looked down at the tiny flickering lights of Lochdubh, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had lied, he had manipulated, and he had obstructed the law, but he had kept the village whole. He had ensured that the rhythm of life here, slow and steady and stubborn, would continue for another year. He wasn't a hero, he was just Hamish. He stood up, dusted the grass from his trousers, and whistled for Lugs. "Come on, old friend," he said into the cooling air. "There's a pot of coffee waiting, and I've a feeling tomorrow is going to be the most wonderfully boring day of the year." He walked back down toward the village, his silhouette merging with the twilight, just another part of the Highland landscape. The mystery of the missing Laird was already beginning to fade, relegated to a bit of local folklore that would be told in the pub on rainy nights for years to come. And Hamish Macbeth, the most useless policeman in Scotland, was exactly where he wanted to be, home. Chapter 11. The Unbearable Weight of Nothing. A week after the departure of the Strathbane murder squad, the village of Lochdubh had settled back into its customary state of benign neglect. The newspapers in Inverness had run a short dismissive piece about the tragic death of tech mogul at Highland wellness site, followed by an even smaller paragraph about the unfortunate accident of a suspect falling to his death in the crags. As far as the outside world was concerned, the case was closed, filed away under unpleasant tourist mishaps. For Hamish Macbeth, the return to normal was both a relief and a minor irritation. The village, having survived the excitement of a murder, had reverted to its obsession with the mundane. Mrs. Wellington was back to complaining about the quality of the wool at the post office. Archie McLean was once again grumbling about the price of diesel, and the local minister was once more lamenting the dwindling attendance at the Sunday service. Hamish sat at his desk, staring at a stack of paperwork that Blair had left behind. A series of follow-up requirements that were largely redundant now that the case was officially marked as solved. He picked up a pen, twirled it, and then set it down with a sigh. He decided, with his usual degree of professional detachment, that these forms were best served by being filed in the bin. He was interrupted by the sound of the front door creaking open. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped inside, bringing with her a gust of cold, crisp air and the faint, elegant scent of expensive perfume that always seemed out of place in the cramped, paraffin-scented station. "I see you're still alive, Hamish," she said, eyeing the stack of forms in the bin. "I assume you haven't been promoted yet." "Not yet," Hamish said, leaning back in his chair and putting his feet up on the desk. "I'm working very hard at being as disappointing as possible. It's a full-time job." Priscilla smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached her eyes. She walked over to the stove, checked that the kettle was on, and then turned to face him. "You did it, you know. Blair left thinking he was a genius. The village thinks the transient was the killer, and life is continuing exactly as it was. It's a masterpiece of misdirection." "I just wanted a quiet life, Priscilla," Hamish said, his tone softening. "The village is a delicate thing. It doesn't like being poked by outsiders, whether they're tech millionaires or bombastic detectives. I just restored the balance." "You're a strange man," she said, sitting on the edge of his table. You have the mind of a master strategist and the ambition of a hibernating bear. Doesn't it ever bore you? Aham be de the pair, sitting here waiting for the rain to stop, drinking instant coffee while the rest of the world is moving on? The world moving on is exactly what I'm trying to avoid, Hamish replied, watching the steam rise from the kettle. People think peace is boring, but peace is the hardest thing to keep. It takes a lot of work to make sure nothing changes. Priscilla looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. I think you're right, but don't be surprised if one day the world finds its way back to your door. You can't hide forever, Hamish, not even in Lochdubh. I'm not hiding, Hamish said, a small, stubborn smile playing on his lips. I'm just enjoying the view. After she left, the silence of the station felt deeper, more profound. Hamish walked over to the window and looked out at the sea loch. The water was dark and churned by the wind, but the village remained tucked into the bay, a small, safe harbour against the vast, wild landscape of the north. He thought about Dougie, somewhere out there in the big, messy world, and he hoped the boy had found a place where he didn't have to worry about the future. He thought about Sterling, now nothing more than a footnote in a local ledger, his grand designs reduced to a half-finished stone ruin that would soon be reclaimed by the gorse and the moss. The telephone rang again, the third time that morning. Hamish picked it up, expecting it to be someone from the district office asking for a status update. Macbeth, he said, his voice clipped. Hamish, it's Blair. Hamish stiffened. DCI Blair, to what do I owe the pleasure? Don't get smart with me, Blair growled, though there was a strange, hesitant note in his voice. I just wanted to let you know, the Commissioner was quite pleased with the report. He mentioned that the handling of the transient Laird was surprisingly adequate. Hamish let out a slow breath. That's good to hear, sir. Yes, well, Blair cleared his throat. There's a rumour that there might be a vacancy in the Strathbane office next month. A desk job. Administrative oversight, you know, since you're so good at watching the perimeter and keeping things quiet. Hamish's blood ran cold. A desk job. In the city. Away from the hills, away from the loch, away from his life. I'm afraid I'm not really cut out for administrative work, sir, Hamish said, his voice rising in panic. I'm a village constable. I don't know the first thing about office protocol. I'd be a disaster. Honestly, you'd be better off leaving me here where I can at least manage to keep the local sheep in line. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Blair let out a short, sharp snort of laughter. Right, I suppose you would be a disaster. Stay in your village, Macbeth. It's probably the only place where you can't cause too much damage. He hung up. Hamish slowly placed the receiver down, his hand trembling slightly. He looked around his small, cluttered office, at the peeling wallpaper and the ancient, reliable stove. He had come within a hair's breadth of losing it all. He walked to the larder, opened a tin of corned beef, and dropped it into his frying pan. The smell of the food, the warmth of the room, and the soft, rhythmic breathing of Lugs beside him. It was everything. He sat down at his table, the plate of food before him, and breathed a sigh of relief. He was safe, he was home, and as long as he could keep the world at arm's length, he would be exactly as he intended, perfectly, blissfully, and professionally useless. Chapter 12. The season of mists and murmurs. Autumn had descended upon Lochdubh with a sudden shivering grace. The mountains, which had spent the summer cloaked in a soft, verdant green, were now bruised with deep purples and burnt oranges. The wind that blew off the sea had developed a sharper edge, a reminder that the long, dark winter was waiting just over the horizon to reclaim the valley. For Hamish Macbeth it was the best time of year. The tourists had long since fled back to their centrally heated lives, the midges had finally succumbed to the frost, and the village had returned to its natural state of quiet, brooding solitude. He was sitting on the wooden pier, a fishing rod in his hand and a flask of hot, strong coffee tucked into his coat pocket. Lugs was curled up in a ball of fur beside him, ears twitching at the sound of the waves. It had been a month since the MacFarlane estate case had been quietly shelved, and the memory of Richard Sterling had already begun to bleach away, like a scrap of linen left too long in the sun. He saw a figure approaching from the direction of the village. It was the postman, an elderly man named Angus, who moved with the slow, rhythmic gait of someone who had walked every mile of the glen for 40 years. Angus paused when he reached the pier and pulled a letter from his bag. "Morning, Hamish," Angus called out, his voice thin in the wind. "Got a bit of post for you. Doesn't look like an urgent bill, so I didn't rush." Hamish stood up, his joints creaking, and walked over to take the envelope. It was heavy, cream-coloured, and bore the official seal of the regional police headquarters. He frowned. He had hoped that with the case closed, Strathbane would have forgotten he existed for at least another 6 months. He ripped it open. It was a formal notification from the chief constable. He scanned the lines, his heart sinking. It wasn't a promotion, thank God, but it was an invitation to an appreciation dinner in Inverness, to be held in honour of the successful closure of the recent MacFarlane investigation. Trouble? Angus asked, squinting at Hamish's face. Not trouble, Hamish muttered, stuffing the letter into his pocket. Just an honour. Apparently they want to feed me salmon and listen to speeches. Sounds ghastly, Angus agreed, nodding sagely. I'd rather have a bowl of broth and a quiet fire. My thoughts exactly, Hamish said. He watched Angus continue his rounds, then turned his gaze back to the loch. He would have to go to the dinner, of course. To refuse would be to draw attention to himself, and the last thing he wanted was to be noticed by the higher-ups. He would have to wear his one decent suit, keep his head down, murmur a few platitudes about teamwork, and then slip away the moment the cake was served. It was a small price to pay for the continued peace of his life. Later that evening, the village was bathed in the soft golden light of twilight. Hamish walked up the main street, passing the quiet windows of the cottages. He saw Mrs. McPhee through the glass of her shop, meticulously dusting jars of sweets. He saw Archie MacLean fixing a net in his shed, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of his work echoing against the hills. There was a profound, stubborn continuity to Lochdubh that he loved more than he could ever articulate. People came and went, they built dream houses and planned retreats. They brought their anger and their ambition and their noise. But the village remained. It absorbed them, it outlasted them, and it slowly, quietly, returned to its own steady pulse. He stopped at the bridge, the same bridge where he had confronted Priscilla a month ago. He looked down at the dark, swirling water. It looked innocent now, reflecting the first pale stars of the evening. He knew that another crime would come eventually. Someone else would lose their temper, or their greed would get the better of them, or a secret would finally become too heavy to carry. The village was not a sanctuary. It was a living, breathing thing, and living things occasionally bled. But when the time came, he would be here. He would be the quiet observer, the man in the oversized coat who sat in the corner and drank his tea. He didn't need a medal, and he certainly didn't need a promotion. He just needed the rhythm of the tides, the smell of the peat smoke in the air, and the knowledge that, for now, the balance was restored. As he reached his station, he paused at the door. He turned around one last time to look at the village. The lights were twinkling like fallen stars against the dark fabric of the mountains. It was his village, and he was in his own way its protector, the shepherd of the secrets, the guardian of the quiet. He pushed the door open, the warm paraffin-scented air greeting him like an old friend. He hung up his coat, whistled for Lugs, and went to the stove to put the kettle on for a final cup of the day. "Not a bad life, Lugs," he murmured, his voice lost in the hum of the tea kettle. "Not bad at all." He sat down in his chair, pulled his pipe from his pocket, and stared into the heart of the fire. The case was truly over. The dinner in Inverness would be a minor inconvenience, and tomorrow the sun would rise over the hills of Sutherland, and he would have absolutely nothing to do but walk the moors, watch the clouds, and enjoy the blissful, beautiful, and hard-earned weight of being absolutely nothing at all. In the village of Lochdubh, the wind sighed, the water stirred, and Hamish Macbeth, the laziest policeman in the Highlands, finally slept.